Hi, thanks for playing this summary recording of the latest skills session from the Community Research Initiative. This was a super practical 1-hour session on active listening and creative storytelling skills, and it was intended to prepare you for the first introductory meetings that you might have with potential voluntary sector collaborators. An introduction is a story, right? So let's think about how you would introduce yourself at a research conference, say, or maybe a large work meeting. Jot down some of the things that you might say. Okay, I've done this too. I imagined how I would have introduced myself at a citizen science conference about the Community Research Initiative. So citizen science places the citizen or communities at the centre as the research expert who knows what's important research for them. So CRIS has an element of citizen science in it. So here's how I would introduce myself. My name is Dr. Anne Leyburn, and I'm going to talk to you today about the Community Research Initiative, which I run at UCL for master's students. I did my own master's in 2003 in gerontology at King's College London, and then I went on to do my PhD in gerontology also at King's, focusing on older people and falls prevention. I worked for a number of years as a research associate at various universities and charities, and then I moved into professional services at the university by taking on this job with the Community Research Initiative, which can be considered in the realms of citizen science, in that it encourages our local community to identify themselves what is useful for research and connecting them with research support and collaborators. So that's my example of my introduction. Keep that in mind. For a few minutes' time, we'll come back to it. So in this session, we focused on three things really. We started with storytelling and finding you in your research, linking your story to the story of your research. We talked about listening and hearing, and we also talked about reaching consensus.
Below this video, you will find a link to The Power of Vulnerability by Brené Brown, a TED Talk. Please pause this video and follow the link. Watch that video until 1 minute and 36 seconds and then return here.
In the TED Talk, I think what the speaker does really well is use humour and use a personal story to begin her presentation. She added the ingredient that's so often missing, which is herself. So let's reframe the idea of an introduction. In our context of introductions at a research conference or a work meeting, you should consider it a story. It's a story about you and how you came to this research that you're presenting, or how you came to the piece of work that you're presenting. The most compelling speakers that I see are the ones who really make it personal. They share something of themselves and they show a generosity. They give a connection point by maybe including something of their lived experience or something about themselves. You're showing a trust in the other person by doing this, and you speak in a more globally accessible way as well. So you're starting from a position of humanity and not academia, and that really changes your language. It anchors the listener and it makes you really relatable. So having, adding humanity or a story hooks into an emotion. So it doesn't have to be funny like the TED Talk to get a laugh. It can be another emotion, but it's important that it's a hook to hook in your listeners. So now think back to my introduction of myself at a citizen science conference that I did earlier in this recording. That's actually how I would have introduced myself a number of years ago now, but here's how I introduce myself now. So my name is Anne, and I was surrounded by citizen science before I even knew the words actually. My dad was a bird watcher. There were always calls from across the county. I come from a really remote part of the far north of Scotland, and we were always getting calls from people about injured birds. And actually to the extent that a really early memory for me is of a recuperating buzzard flying around our kitchen, and also picking up roadkill on the way home from school to feed the buzzard. And all the driving we did as a family were bird watching possibilities. I actually remember when I was trying to cajole my dad into giving me a lift into town that, oh, but wouldn't it be good because you could count the geese, on the way. I kind of used it as a bartering tool. When I think about it now, that was data collection. And when wind farms became something that local farmers started putting lots of applications in, it was my dad they came to who provided reports of impact to wildlife for the local authorities to make decisions on whether or not a wind farm should be granted. And in fact, the last thing that my dad was doing the day before he died was with single fingers determinedly entering data into an Excel spreadsheet so that he could digitize his decades of written bird notes to be shared with his birding community nationally and internationally. But my dad was a carpenter. He didn't go to university. He was an expert, though. So, citizen science and acknowledging the power of local knowledge and crowdsourcing data was really threaded throughout my childhood and maybe unconsciously brought me to the Community Research Initiative, which is what I want to talk to you about today. Okay, so what was different about my second story about myself? Write down a few words that struck you as you were listening to my second introduction as compared to my first. And now think about what you might say now compared to your first introduction. How might you introduce yourself now? What is the connection between you and your research ideas? Does it come from a place of identity, of origin, perhaps your family? So take a moment now to jot down what you might say as an introduction. Reframe your research story. It's not unprofessional. It's about putting humanity back at the centre of what you do. So the second part of this session was active listening and why is it so important to collaboration. So let's make it crystal clear that what we're talking about is listening and not just hearing. So there's rightly a distinction to be made about hearing someone and listening to someone. So hearing is hearing sound, being aware of sound. We all know that we've all been in a situation where someone's been talking to us, but we haven't really listened, so we're not quite sure what they said because there was something else going on. And so the difference with listening is that it's about paying attention to the sound, and it's this paying attention bit that we're going to look at. So what's really at the center of working in partnership with someone or people and collaborating is relationships, and listening is the essential part of any relationship, and it's probably the best way to build and maintain a relationship. It's really essential for you to those initial ideas sharing meetings, so for you to ask good questions and really actively listen to what's being said back to you, and it should be obvious that you are actively listening. Okay, so it seems obvious to say, but there is kind of internal and external distractions that you should really work hard to block out. The external ones are maybe the easier ones to deal with, and it seems obvious to say, but turning off phone or device notifications, maybe turning on the new focus function in iOS 15 if you're an Apple user. Even the act of doing this will have an effect and make you ready for the conversation. In an online setting, it's also important to shut down your email or any other programs that might send through notifications. And perhaps less easy is dampening down those internal distractions. Essays are looming, your internet is dodgy, you think you might get chucked out of a room that you thought you'd booked. So if you do find that you're not great at closing down this kind of internal chatter, then it might be worth making sure you're always there early, You could maybe try some breath work or meditation, or making notes and rereading your notes just to get yourself into the zone. You could try to manage any internet worries beforehand. You could email to say that this is what's happening, perhaps consider rescheduling so you're not wasting time, or at the very least letting them know that if you do drop off of an online call, you will endeavour to get back onto it. So just own that, and that will help the internal chatter become less of a distraction. And so what are there's four key elements of listening and actively listening. And without stating the completely obvious, a conversation is about taking turns essentially, and you have different roles. You have the talker and you have the listener. And these roles have got actions associated with them. And so for the listener, there's kind of four: non-verbal communication, verbal, responding, and something that I've called it's all about them. So the non-verbal communication is not it's not only your non-verbal, but also the speaker's non-verbal. So first of all, it's about demonstrating that you're engaged, so no devices out, maintaining eye contact if possible, your body's kind of oriented towards the person speaking. I've definitely been in professional situations where someone I'm having a conversation with will remain sitting at their computer while I'm speaking, or in group meetings, check emails and be constantly scrolling whilst listening, in inverted commas. And it was actually with the same person, a completely different ball game, when they moved away from their computer and actually sat round a table with me for the conversation. So it's really important. I mean, those are very, extreme examples, but it's really important to work on your non-verbal communication, that you are listening. And the other thing is about the looking out for the speaker's non-verbal, so you can pick up on cues like maybe they're perhaps nervous or frustrated or stressed. There's then verbal communication. So ask good questions and then let the speaker answer fully. And in doing this, you can use what's called small utterances to show that you're listening. So things like saying, oh, yeah, that really makes sense, or aha, gosh, yes. Those small, not full sentences, noises that just keep the other person knowing that you are listening to what they're saying. The third thing is about responding to what someone's just said. So this is the bit that really sets you apart and puts you right in the camp of good active listener, is that you give once the talker is finished, you give an informed response back to them. So you reflect back what you've just heard. I've never thought about X before. Or, okay, so I noticed that you said Y. I wondered, why do you think that happened there? So keeping the focus, the fourth thing is about keeping the focus on the other person, and it's about resisting the temptation to come in with your own story, even if it's a really related story. You're trying to show maybe empathy, or yep, I really get that. And this is kind of a good balance between listening and storytelling. And personally, my storytelling really comes out sometimes when I should be listening, and I'm a big interrupter, and it's definitely part of my active listening skills that I need to work on. So those are the four kind of key elements of active listening. Take a moment now to think about, is there anything that you feel you need to practice? Okay, so just take a think about maybe your last meeting or your last interactive seminar or workshop. Think about who was the speaker. Reflect back. Did you notice any non-verbal cues from them? Did they seem frustrated, or were they distracted? Think about your own non-verbal cues. Were you kind of facing them? Did you make eye contact? How did you let them know that you were listening? Was your phone or other devices off? Did you check any messages during the meeting or seminar? Have a think now about what your active listening might have looked like to that speaker. So something that we touched on a bit after we did the active listening and creative storytelling was really thinking about that partnerships are about people, and a relationship at the very centre, and negotiation and compromise. So it is worth just touching on the topic of assumptions and biases, and maybe having a real self-reflection about you yourself. What do you bring into a conversation and the interactions that you have? What might what might someone assume of you, and what might you assume of other people? What are your biases? We all have them. How do we enter a room? What baggage do we take with us? And how do we see the world? What's our lens, and what are other people's lenses that you might be going into a room with together? And so we encourage people to do a home task. Harvard has got an implicit biases online digital tool that you can use. And we would just really encourage you to take a look at this. There's a long list of different biases, gender, ethnicity, sexuality, lots of different topics on which you can check in with your biases, and just have a real reflection on how you might enter a room and what you bring with you. And it's just about acknowledging that. And finally, we just talked a little bit about reaching consensus. In the Community Research Initiative, your listening and storytelling skills will be really essential in the kind of introductory meetings, the sharing idea meetings, and listening to each other. And coming to a consensus is essential for collaborative work. If you think about it like a pendulum, you've got you on one side, if you like, and the community partner, potential partner on the other side. And what you're trying to do is tell stories with the other person listening backwards and forwards like a pendulum until you come to a consensus about something that you might both like to see as part of a research project. And so, this is all about sharing power, and the community organization on the other side having equal knowledge that you do. It's about building community together. And by reaching consensus, it might take a little bit longer, but we would argue that better decisions are made, and to embrace differences and explore differences, because decisions that are made after differences have been explored, and everyone has, whether they have agreed, they've certainly agreed to disagree. And things really get done when consensus is reached because everyone feels some ownership, and consensus working really protects minority views rather than those who are privileged enough to be listened to or shout loudly. And so we would encourage our students to really think about the skills to use, how to reach consensus. So the three skills that we talked about or practiced during this session was the storytelling, and really finding you and placing you in the centre of your research story or your work story. We talked about listening and hearing skills, particularly being an active listener. And we pulled those two things together to show you how your storytelling skills and your active listening skills can help reach consensus, which is what's at the very centre of what we're encouraging you to do on the Community Research Initiative, which is start kind of co-designing ideas that might form your dissertation. So thanks so much for watching this summary recording, and we hope it was useful.